Chapter 23. Unexpected Benefactor. The gates opened slowly with a loud creaking sound that Reyes felt certain must have alerted the entire castle. Then the portcullis rattled as it was lifted, and if that wasn't enough, the drawbridge hit the ground on the far side of the moat with a loud bang. Reyes cowered back against the walls of the winch house and waited there as Tyr stepped out into the open ground below the main gates of the castle and waved to the soldiers on the battlements. "Everything is all right. I was informed that the gate seemed to be a little bit wonky when it was opened earlier. We're just checking out the mechanism now rather than be embarrassed when the king leaves us tomorrow." From where he was hiding, Reyes couldn't see any reaction from the guards. Nor did he hear a reply of any kind. A few seconds later, Tyr waved him towards the gate, indicating that it was safe for him to leave. Reyes followed Tyr's instruction. He hurried out of the gates of the castle. Once he had crossed the threshold, he turned and waved a final goodbye to Tyr. He couldn't help the feeling that he wouldn't see any of his family ever again. Terror clutched at his heart as the moat swirled before him. The best time to cross the moat would be when the drawbridge was pulled up, because then there was less chance of any of the guards on the wall seeing him. If he didn't use the drawbridge though, he was going to have to swim the moat, and that wasn't something he was willing to even consider. Aware that any step he took might be his last, Reyes moved quietly across the drawbridge. He felt his heart stop for a moment with every creak it made. He wasn't going to get a second chance at this. Certain that he was going to be spotted at any moment, Reyes made it to the far side of the moat. Before he continued further from the castle, Reyes couldn't resist a quick glance back at what had been his home for the last 6.5 years. He could see that the two guards who were on duty at the top of the gatehouse, the two guards who were most likely to have noticed him leaving, were being distracted by something happening down in the courtyard. Reyes assumed it was Tyr's doing and silently thanked his brother for the distraction. Then he began to run. He wanted to put as much distance between himself and the castle as he could, as quickly as he could. There wasn't much out here in the way of cover, at least until Reyes reached the trees. For 500 yards all about the castle there was nothing but grass, weeds, and a few wild flowers. The only cover of any kind Reyes had was the darkness of night. The further he got from the castle, the less likely it was that someone was going to see him. That didn't stop him hearing his own heart as it beat madly with the expectation of getting caught. Nor did it stop his imagination as Reyes kept thinking he could hear someone back at the castle screaming about his escape. After what felt as if it had been hours, but was really only a few minutes, he reached the outskirts of the forest. It seemed as if his entire body relaxed as the fear of immediate capture waned. He still wasn't safe, but the hardest part of his escape was over. Before ducking into the forest, Reyes took one final look at the castle. There was a line of torches illuminating the battlements, seeming to make a neat little dotted line in the distance. Reyes was too far away to see what the guards were up to, or even if the drawbridge had been closed again. "One day I will return," he promised to himself. It was dark in the forest. Reyes had to renew his cat sight spell in order to see anything of where he was going. Even then, he had to feel rather than see his way through some of the darker parts of the forest. The floor was rough and uneven, and his strange feet seemed to encourage him to trip, or stub one of his toes often. He even fell over more than once. The village of the Moth was a very small village. More than anything, it existed to supply the castle with servants. A lot of the castle servants even had homes in the village and would return every night to their families. The village might be small, but it was where the three major roads of Florif met. The King's Eastern Highway went south all the way to First Town. The King's Western Highway headed towards Ganespa, where it too would then turn drastically south before eventually curving back towards the city of Loughton on the southern border of the Dukedom of Borton. Finally, there was the coastal road, which went east, and as the name suggested, ran along the eastern coast of the country. It would eventually meet the other two roads in the city of Loughton. It didn't take long for Reyes to consider his options. The King's Eastern Highway went south, and Reyes wanted to go north. He began to follow the coastal road as best he could. It was dark, and even with cat sight, he could see very little. Once he skirted the village, he began to feel a little safer again. The night was quiet. There were no baying hounds out for his blood, nor was there the heavy thump of approaching hooves. No one was giving chase yet. Hopefully no one even knew he was gone, and wouldn't until the king found his cell empty tomorrow morning. By then he hoped he'd be far away and safely across the border. He began to take stock of his situation. Despite everything, Reyes struggled to believe he wasn't human. He had spent more than 6 years of his life enchanted to be something he wasn't, and he was finding it hard to accept reality. Unable to feel his wings or tail, it was only the awkwardness of his bare feet that betrayed the truth. At least his harpy fetish didn't seem quite so perverse now. He thought about his family, how they had gathered to help him escape, even Greyforth, who had always acted a little bit distant. Reyes understood why now, especially as Greyforth had somehow earned a reputation as the bane of harpies, despite the fact that the last harpy he had seen had to have been at the siege of Golspon. Even Prince Goatee had been there. Reyes had a friend in the royal family. It was a shame that the king wanted his head. One day Prince Goatee would replace his father as king, but Reyes doubted he'd ever see that day. King Erestein was only in his mid-40s, and that was relatively young for a human. He thought about Mangloss, and the spells he had learnt in his short life. Mangloss hadn't taught him a single offensive spell. Well, there was sleep, but that was more defensive since Reyes couldn't imagine taking advantage of a prone enemy. He began to go through the list of spells in his head. It was pitifully short. Most of them had some use. Heal was probably the most useful, and while he knew how to cast regeneration, he had never been able to concentrate enough to actually cast it. The most useless spell in his repertoire had to be Rust. Next he thought about his father's lessons. If he was going to live with the elves, it would be good to remember what he could about them. There was something about not eating elven food, but he couldn't remember what. He was sure Jenny would know, but since he couldn't exactly go back and ask her, it was a moot point. The problem was Reyes had never really cared to learn about elves. He had always been more interested in the harpy lessons. He was maybe a mile east of the village of the Moth, still contemplating his situation, when he caught sight of something laying in the road. It was a dead body. The sight sent a shiver along Reyes' spine. He had seen dead bodies before. He had seen them 2 years or more ago hanging from the gallows in Lamington. He hadn't enjoyed the experience then, and being so close to a corpse now made his skin creep. Reyes forced himself to check the corpse over. Whoever it was had been wearing chainmail armour and wielding a weird-looking curved sword. The sword was still in the corpse's hand. An arrow had pierced the very centre of his chest. This, no doubt, was what had killed him. Reyes swallowed deeply and forced himself to check one final detail. He ran his fingers along the ears of the corpse. They were pointed. This was an elf. Reyes glanced quickly to the trees on either side of the road. Where could this elf have come from? Were there any more? Reyes got up slowly and looked about himself worriedly. Almost without thinking, he unhitched his bow and took an arrow from his quiver, just in case. Reyes didn't feel safe out here alone. He certainly wasn't in the mood to start digging a grave in the middle of the night, especially not when the king could discover that he had escaped at any moment and order a nighttime hunt after him. Instead, with an arrow at the ready, Reyes proceeded carefully along the road. He had walked maybe 10 more yards when he saw another shape lying in the road just up ahead. Another body? Reyes moved closer to what he assumed was a second corpse, and as he covered more ground, he could see more and more shapes lying on the road. It was almost as if he had discovered some kind of battlefield. The corpse he had checked a few moments ago was just one of many. Reyes approached the carnage slowly, unhappy with having to share the road with so many dead. At least they were all elves. He counted no less than 20 of them, all shot down by arrows. Then he came across his first human, a knight. The man had obviously been overwhelmed, pulled from his horse and stabbed many times through what gaps there were in his armour. He bore the arms of Duke Arliss. Reyes felt a little confused. Duke Arliss would have been better off taking the Eastern Highway because the main ferry to his island city harboured at First Town. Why would the Duke have chosen this path? The only thing Reyes could think of was that he must have been lured this way for some reason. But how? Why? And by whom? As the road continued, so did the scene of carnage. If anything, the bodies were closer together now as the two forces had clashed in some epic struggle. Most of the dead were still elves. Very few of these had arrows in them and had instead been cut down by sword. For For every 8 to 10 dead elves, there was a dead knight, and occasionally a dead horse. What must have possessed the elves to be willing to throw away so many lives? Reyes thought to himself. He knew he should leave things well alone. He needed to head north towards Alistrade. Even if he was in time to aid the Duke, he would be more likely to be mistaken for an enemy than a friend. On the other hand, the Duke's knights had been on horseback. In order to keep up, the elves must also have been on horseback, and there were very few dead horses on the road. There had to be a fair number of riderless horses nearby. If he, Reyes, could find one of these horses, he could ride north. He would not only put more distance between him and the castle, but he would also be able to rest his poor tortured feet. It wasn't much longer before he saw the Duke's coach sitting on the side of the road, as if it had been parked there. Forgetting his current appearance, Reyes hurried forward towards the coach. Maybe he could do something to help the survivors. His legs moaned at the extra exertion. He had been on the move since leaving the castle, and they wanted him to stop and take a rest. The coach had stopped because someone had shot one of the horses that had been pulling it. The other horses were gone. Likewise, the driver of the coach was nowhere to be seen, but Reyes wouldn't have been surprised to find his body back on the road somewhere. The remaining soldiers in Duke Arliss's employ had evidently been pitifully few at this point, but they had created a defensive perimeter around the coach and had made a very good showing. There were a lot more dead elves than dead humans, even here. The Duke himself had come out to aid the defence of the coach, and he too lay dead, surrounded by over a dozen elven foes. There was nothing Reyes could do. This battle could have been fought 5 hours ago, or 5 minutes ago. He was still too late to be of assistance. He sighed, and looked through the window of the coach. There were bodies in the coach as well. The Duke and his last few men had fought hard to defend the Duke's wife and his young 5-year-old daughter. The two of them were sitting in the coach side by side. They were both dead, both struck by stray arrows sometime during the battle. The daughter looked more like some kind of rag doll, rather than someone who had once been alive. Reyes felt certain there was something wrong with her body. He wasn't sure what it was, but there seemed to be a faint hint of a blue glow coming from her, as if her entire corpse was in some way magical. Perhaps Arliss's mage advisor had tried to cast a protective spell over the Duke's daughter, but it hadn't been enough. If that was the case, where was the mage advisor? Reyes sighed. There was nothing he could do here. He couldn't even return to the castle and report this. His best bet was to leave it alone and press on through the forest towards the border of Alistrade. Reyes turned away from the scene. Before he got 3 steps, he heard the sound of crying coming from the coach. Reyes hurried back to the coach. Someone was still alive in there. He opened the door on his side and tried not to think about the dead bodies. He entered. The crying continued. Reyes listened carefully and realized that the Duchess must have hidden a second child under the bench on which she was sitting. Had the child remained silent, Reyes would never have known the baby was there. Clearly, the elves had never found him. He reached under the bench and pulled the baby free. Now what? He still couldn't go back to the castle with the young child, but neither could he press on across the border carrying a human child. In the end, Reyes felt he had little choice. There were a number of small villages all over this part of the dukedom. He would have to find one, avoid the soldiers that his father had sent to act as a militia, and leave the child on the doorstep in front of one of the houses. Maybe he could even leave the child with the local priest. Reyes pressed on into the forest. He didn't know the exact location of any of the villages, but he was certain he would stumble upon one before too long. He would find a dirt track or a hunting trail, and that would lead him to his goal. The child sat quietly in his arms, no longer crying. If anything, the baby seemed content to be carried by a harpy. Reyes had been pressing on into the forest for about half an hour when he thought he heard the distant sound of another baby crying. He stopped moving for a moment and listened again. Had he imagined it? The baby in his arms was remaining very quiet. Maybe he had heard it because he had expected to hear it. Then he heard it again. It was faint and distant. Tanton is around here somewhere, he thought to himself. He pressed on through the trees towards the sound. Maybe the baby was somewhere in that village. The sound of a baby crying got clearer as he advanced. It was much more distinctive. It sounded as if the child was out in the open somewhere, and not behind closed doors, being looked after by its mother the way a child should be. Reyes almost stepped into the elven camp before he realised it. It wasn't much of a camp. There weren't many elves there. There were no tents. A few of the elves were sleeping out in the open under thick woolen blankets. Other elves were up and about. Some were chatting to each other, while others still were keeping a watchful eye for possible intruders. There were also a couple who appeared to be guarding their horses, rough-looking beasts, nothing like the quality of human steeds. Reyes estimated that there were only about 25 to 30 elves in the camp. Reyes couldn't help but notice that there were also 2 children in the middle of the camp. They sat near a large fire. There was a young 5-year-old girl who looked and was dressed very much like the rag-doll corpse that Reyes had seen back at the Duke's coach. She was tied up with a heavy rope and was crying softly into her hands. The other was a baby. He lay on a tree stump next to the girl and was wrapped in a blanket of the type that human parents would have put him in. He too was crying. It was his crying that Reyes had heard. Also, over near the fire, a large white pole had been stuck into the ground, and around it were tied 3 horses, spoils of the battle. 2 of the horses were white and of the same type as the dead horse that had been put in the coach. The other was black in colour and still wore the heavy plate armour of a knight's charger. Reyes couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the final white horse. He glanced down at the child in his arms, and suddenly everything began to make sense. He was carrying a changeling. The elves had wanted to replace the Duke of Arliss with their own puppet for some reason. The young girl's body was a magical construct. It would probably last about a week and then decay into nothing, just long enough for the body to be interned. The 2 real children would be taken to Elistrade and sold into slavery. Maybe they would be given as gifts to the Emperor. Reyes had heard that there was a lot of kudos to be had in elven society for owning a human noble slave. He considered the child in his arms. Even though he knew the child was nothing more than a changeling, he loathed to leave it. Instead he laid the child next to the base of a tree. He knew he should kill it, but couldn't bring himself to do so. When required, an elf could move very silently. With such superior hearing, though, it was virtually impossible for even an elf to take a harpy by surprise. Reyes' attention was suddenly drawn away from the camp at the sound of movement behind him. He quickly took one of his arrows from the quiver and knocked it to his bow. Emerging from the forest behind him was an elven soldier. Reyes wouldn't have been able to see the elf at all if it hadn't been for the cat sight spell. As it was, the elf was little more than a shadow in the dark. The elf was also carrying a bow, and he too had an arrow readied. "Hello," Reyes greeted the elf awkwardly in the harpy tongue. He tried not to show how scared he was. The elf stepped closer. His bow trained directly on Reyes. Reyes returned the favour by keeping his bow aimed towards the elf. "A harpy?" The elf seemed more than a little surprised to see Reyes here, not seeming to notice the changeling child. "What are you doing here? Why are you spying on our camp?" the elf asked. Reyes looked at the soldier blankly. He had learnt Elistran for 4 years, but the elf spoke quickly and Reyes had trouble keeping up. It didn't help that he needed time to translate some of the more complicated words into Flourish first. As it was, he got lost halfway through and forgot what the elf had said next. He decided to act dumb. It shouldn't be hard to believe that a harpy didn't understand Elvish. Reyes replied in the harpy tongue. "What did you say?" The elf sighed and shook his head sadly. He then lowered his bow carefully and with his left hand pointed towards the camp, making a clear signal that Reyes should enter it. For a moment, Reyes considered just shooting the elf. With the bracelets and the short range, he was sure he couldn't miss. However, the elf might make a noise, and his body would be hard to explain. Besides, Reyes couldn't bring himself to end the life of another, even an elf. Moving slowly, he lowered his bow as well and returned the arrow to his quiver. Then he entered the camp. Now he was in the camp, he was feeling very exposed. There were maybe 30 elves in the camp, and every one of them began to leave what they were doing and come over to see what was happening. Even those who had been sleeping were being woken by their comrades and alerted to the arrival of a harpy. Reyes couldn't help it. He wanted to move his hands. He wanted to cover himself from all those prying eyes. He resisted the urge, but Only just. The words of his brother came to mind. Harpies aren't embarrassed about being naked. Reyes gritted his teeth and let his hands fall to his side. He would just have to grin and bear it. Step back, someone was ordering in Elvish. Then, one elf in particular stepped forward. He had a sash across his breast that Reyes felt was supposed to mark him out as the leader. Whether he had been the leader before the battle, or was simply the highest ranking survivor, was neither here nor there. This was the elf in charge now. Other than the sash, there didn't seem to be too much that was unusual about him. He was even wearing the same sort of chainmail that the other members of his little band all seemed to have. "Greetings, Harpy," this leader elf said. His voice was dripping with contempt. "I am Gentine, leader of this band of elves. What are you doing in this part of the country? Are you lost? Where is your village? And why was he spying on us?" said the elf Reyes first encountered. Gentine said nothing, but he nodded to his comrade in arms. Reyes cast his eyes over the gathered elven multitude and then shrugged his shoulders. "I have absolutely no idea what you just said." "Really?" Gentine commented. He sounded quite doubtful. Then, as a nasty surprise to Reyes, he switched effortlessly into the Harpy tongue. It seemed that Gentine was fluent in both languages. He repeated the questions. Reyes still had a little trouble keeping up with what Gentine said. It was one thing to converse with someone who speaks slowly enough that he has time to think about what is being said, but it is quite another to be thrown into the deep end. Reyes hesitated to answer for a moment, but then, fearing that the elf might get suspicious if Reyes didn't say anything at all, he replied, "I think I'm lost," in the hope that it would make some sense in respect to the elf's questions. "And you just happened to find us?" Gentine said skeptically. Reyes understood that a little easier. It wasn't as long. "I heard the baby crying," he answered quickly. Gentine gave Reyes an evil little smile. "And you thought you heard the sound of dinner. I understand. You're not welcome among us, Harpy. We only tolerate your kind because you make good soldiers. If I had my way, we'd execute every last one of you. However, I suppose we are allies. We're leaving for Goldspawn at first light. We need to re-outfit. You may come with us if you wish." "Thank you," Reyes replied, feeling a little unsure. He wasn't too certain as to what the elf had said, but he had clearly heard the word welcome. "Yes," another commented, evidently confident that the Harpy couldn't understand him. "We can always find a market for a Harpy." "We should disarm him," a third uttered. Gentine's expression became one of pure contempt for a moment or two. Then suddenly his eyes lit up, and he became very amicable. "I see you have a lovely looking sword. You look a bit on the young side to have fought in any real battle. Is it a family heirloom or something?" "Yes, indeed," Reyes agreed. He tried to piece the words together and then he said, "It's a trophy. I won it in battle." "Battle? You?" Gentine almost spat. Then again the amicability returned to his voice. "It looks quite heavy. Don't you find it holds you down when you fly?" "A little," Reyes replied. The short phrases were easier to understand. He began to wonder what the elf was getting at. "I've had no trouble so far." "I'll tell you what," Gentine said, a big smile on his face. "I like that sword. I like your bracelets too, but I think your sword would make a nice addition to my collection. Why don't you make me a gift of it, as a thank you for us showing you the way back to Ellistrade? At the same time, you'll no longer have something like that weighing you down so much." "Sorry, what?" Reyes said without thinking. The elf had been speaking Harpy, so it was a mistake to make him think that Reyes didn't understand what he had said. Gentine looked confused. "I said, you give me the sword, we take you to Ellistrade." "Oh, no," Reyes replied, quickly adding, "I thought that was what you said." He then paused and added, "I couldn't possibly do that." "Then I'll fight you for the sword," Gentine insisted. "Why would I do that?" Reyes asked, confused. "I already have the sword." "Put it this way," Gentine told him. "You're going to give me that sword, or you're going to fight. You can either fight me one-on-one, fair and square, or you can fight All of us. Gentine unsheathed his sword and stuck it in the ground just in front of him, emphasizing the point. Reyes took a few moments to walk through what the elf had just said. Then he glanced around at the gathered elves, scattered as they were. Reyes felt he would have a hard time trying to defend against them. "Well?" Gentine asked, quickly growing impatient. "I'm thinking," Reyes said. "I'm not sure that what's left of your army would be much of a challenge for me." Gentine laughed. Then he turned to face the crowd of elves and shouted, "He thinks he can take us all on single-handed!" There were a number of taunts and catcalls from the elves. Some of them even readied their weapons. A few were urging Gentine to let them have a little of the fun. "But I'm trying to decide if it's worth the risk. If all else fails, try bravado," Reyes thought to himself. "I don't need them," Gentine informed him. "I am one of the best swords in Alistrade. I used to make my living by protecting farms from harpy raids. Harpies who were a lot more experienced in the ways of fighting than your meagre years could possibly allow. Do you really think you'll be any sort of match for me? Your strength means nothing to me. Let's face it, you're a harpy. What's more, you're male. Even the youngest of elves learn that male harpies aren't trained in the ways of fighting. I doubt you'd have any clue how to use that blade, and do you really think you can get past my defences with just your claws and talons?" "What do I get if I win?" Reyes asked. He had absolutely no idea what the elf had just said. "You get your freedom," Gentine said, "and, obviously, you get to keep the sword." "My freedom?" Reyes pondered the meaning of these words. Were they thinking of him as a slave? "I want the meat. Give me the meat." He hated to refer to the children like that, but it felt like the sort of thing a harpy might say. Gentine laughed. "Those are two very important prisoners. They are far too important to risk on something like this." Reyes wasn't sure what Gentine had said, but it sounded to him very much as if the elf was trying to back down. "I thought you said you were going to win. I thought you said you couldn't lose. Are you having second thoughts? Going to back down in front of your men? It suits me fine, but then I keep the sword." "No, I'm not backing down," Gentine replied. He spoke loudly so the gathered elves could hear him. "If I win, I get the sword. If he wins, we give him the children. Is that clear?" "Melee weapons only," Reyes suggested. He unsheathed his claws as if he was making it obvious that that was how he intended to fight. It didn't occur to him until just after he had done it that he was actually able to unsheath his claws. It gave him hope that his inability to flap his wings was all in his mind. "Agreed," the leader said. Reyes put his bow gently on the ground, and then unhooked his quiver. There was no point having those slow him down and possibly tripping him up while he fought. He then sheathed the claws of his sword hand and drew his blade. Gentine looked both surprised and amused. "Going to try and beat me with a sword?" Reyes stood ready to fight. He held his sword at an awkward angle, trying to play into the idea that he didn't know what to do with it, trying to lull Gentine into making a mistake. Gentine almost laughed. He turned his back on Reyes and walked over to where the little girl was sat. She was still crying. He picked her up and then sat her down so that she could watch the combat. He then spoke to her in almost perfect flourish, saying, "That creature and I are going to fight now. You are to be the prize. If he wins, he will take you with him, and by the morning he will most likely have eaten you. You'd better hope that I win." The little girl took one look in Reyes' direction, and then began to cry even more so than before. Reyes wanted to talk to her. He wanted to tell her that he had no intention of doing anything so barbaric to her. He couldn't. He was sure it would raise too many suspicions among the elves, as it would then be clear that he understood more than he had been pretending. Gentine returned to the spot where he had been standing, and took his sword from the ground. "First blood?" Reyes asked. Gentine laughed. "Whoever heard of a harpy fighting to first blood? Besides, if I let you live, I'd look weak before my men." "To the death, then," Reyes replied. He felt a little shaky as he spoke. Supposedly, killing came easy to harpies. There were a lot of stories in his father's books about harpies were callous, merciless killers. For Reyes, though, This elf would be the first, at least the first he had killed deliberately. To the death, Gentine agreed.